I had lived on that hill for 11 years before the convoy came through, and in all that time, the only visitors I'd had were the postal drone twice a month, and once a compact surveyor who got his truck stuck in the lower ford and had to be hauled out with my tractor. So, when I heard the transports on the corridor road below the ridge that afternoon, I came out onto the porch and watched them the way you'd watch weather moving in, something to note, not something that concerned you. There were 9 vehicles, low and armored, the kind the Velsari ran when they were moving someone important through a corridor that wasn't fully secured. I knew the shape of them from the news feeds. I didn't know much else about the Velsari beyond what everyone knew, that they were a small sovereignty squeezed between 2 larger and less polite ones, that they kept mostly to themselves, that their court had been relocating along the resettlement corridor for the better part of a year, while a border dispute 3 systems over got itself sorted out by people with more patience for that kind of thing than I had. I went back inside. It wasn't my business. I had 41 ewes about to lamb, and a fence on the north pasture that needed mending before the weather turned, and the weather had a particular smell to it that day, a flat gray smell that meant it was turning faster than the forecast said. I want to say something here about who I was before that day, because it matters to the rest of it, and because I found that people listening to this story tend to assume more of me than was ever true. I wasn't a soldier. I wasn't anybody's idea of a hero. I'd laid stone for 30 years down in the valley towns before my knees gave out on me. Good, honest work. Walls and foundations and the occasional chimney. And when Annie died, pneumonia, quick and cruel, 11 winters back, I sold the house we'd shared and bought this hill instead, because I needed somewhere quiet enough that the quiet itself wouldn't feel like an accusation. I kept sheep because sheep don't ask you how you're holding up. I mended fences because a fence either holds or it doesn't, and there's a comfort in problems that simple. I hadn't had 2 consecutive conversations with another living soul, let alone an alien, in longer than I cared to count, and I liked it that way, or had convinced myself I did. So when the convoy passed below the ridge that afternoon, what I felt wasn't curiosity so much as the faint unease of a man whose solitude has been brushed up against by something larger than himself, the way you'd feel a transport go by too close on a narrow road. I noted it. I let it go. That was the whole of my involvement in the Velsari court's business, as far as I understood it that afternoon, and I went back to my wire and my posts with no sense at all of what the night was about to ask of me. By the time the wind picked up in earnest around 4 in the afternoon, I'd half forgotten about the convoy. I was up at the north fence with a roll of wire and a post driver when I heard, faint under the wind, what sounded like vehicles moving too fast on a road not built for it. Then nothing. Then 20 minutes later, 3 of the transports came back up the corridor road going the other direction, fast, lights flashing amber, and didn't stop. I didn't think much of it until I came down off the ridge at dusk and found a man standing at my gate. He was compact, military, not Velsari. I could tell by the cut of his jacket, and he had the particular stillness of a man trying very hard not to look as frightened as he was. "You seen 2 children?" he said. Not a question, really. A man asking the same thing for the 40th time and braced to hear no again. "No," I said. "What happened?" He told me fast, the way people do when they've already told it too many times and the words have worn smooth. The convoy had been moving the Velsari court along the corridor, under a yellow tier security alert. Nothing confirmed, just chatter that made the escort nervous. And somewhere around the second switchback, a transport carrying 2 of the royal children had taken a hard turn to avoid debris in the road and clipped the verge. No one hurt in the crash, but in the scramble to get everyone moving again under alert conditions, in the dark, in weather closing in fast, someone had done a head count wrong. The 2 girls weren't in any of the vehicles when they reached the rally point 4 kilometers down. "How old?" I said. 7, twins. He looked up the ridge behind me at the high pasture at the long gray country running up into cloud. "We've got thermal sweeps up, but this terrain..." He didn't finish it. He didn't have to. I knew that terrain. I'd farmed it for 11 years. It ate thermal signatures whole. All that broken granite holding the day's heat and throwing the readings everywhere. "There's a shelter," I said. "Lower pasture, stone 4 walls, half a roof. If they walk downhill from the road instead of up, that's the first thing they'd find." He looked at me like a man deciding whether to trust a stranger's geography over his own equipment. And then he looked at the sky, which was already starting to spit sleet, and made the only sensible choice. Show me. I didn't wait for him to get back to his radio. I went and got my coat, the heavy one, and a hand lamp, and I told him to follow if he could keep up, because I knew that ground in the dark and he didn't. And 2 children who'd been out in this weather for 2 hours already didn't have time for me to wait on protocol. The ground between my house and the lower pasture is not kind ground after dark. It drops in 3 places where the old quarry workings undercut the soil. And there's a stretch where the path runs along a dry stone wall with a 6-foot drop on the far side that you learn to respect, or you learn the hard way. I'd walked it 10,000 times in daylight and perhaps 100 at night, mostly during lambing, when yous in trouble don't keep office hours. I went down it now faster than I had any business going, the lamp beam jumping ahead of me, the sleet coming sideways hard enough to sting, and somewhere in my chest a feeling had started up that I hadn't had in 11 years, and didn't much want back. The particular cold dread of knowing that somewhere out in weather like this, something small and breathing was running out of time, and that I might not get there fast enough to matter. The officer fell behind within the first 200 meters, which I expected, and didn't blame him for. He didn't know the ground and I did, and there wasn't time to wait for him to learn it. I called back that I'd find them and signal, and kept going. The lower pasture shelter was a half-collapsed thing my grandfather had built for lambing in bad weather, 3 sides of dry stone, and a roof of corrugated tin that had given up on one corner sometime before I was born. It wasn't much, but it cut the wind, and that was the whole of what it needed to do. I found them by smell before I found them by sight, wood smoke faint, coming from inside the shelter, which meant one of them had had the sense, or the desperation, to get a fire going from the kindling I kept stacked there for the use. That told me something about who I was dealing with before I ever saw them. They were huddled together in the driest corner, 2 small shapes under what looked like a torn-off section of someone's coat, and the fire had burned down to almost nothing. Wet wood, no proper draw, the kind of fire a child builds when she's frightened and doing everything right, and it still isn't enough. I went in slow and got down on my knees so I wasn't looming over them, and the smaller of the 2, though there wasn't much in it, they were near enough the same size, flinched back against the stone wall with an expression I'd seen before, a long time ago, on a different kind of frightened animal. The other one stood in front of her sister, put herself between the stranger and the smaller girl without even seeming to think about it. Her hands were shaking, and her lips had gone the wrong color, and she stood there anyway. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said, the way you'd say it to a spooked ewe, low and even, no sudden movement. "I'm Corin. I farm this hill. You're cold, and that fire's about to go out, and I've got a better one, half a kilometer up at my house. That's all I'm here for." Neither of them said anything. The one in front, I'd learn later her name was Myra, had eyes the color of struck flint, pale gray gold, and they didn't waver off me even as her teeth started chattering hard enough that I could hear it. I didn't ask who they were. I want to be honest about that, because people have asked me since why it didn't occur to me, and the truth is it didn't matter. 2 children were going blue in the cold on my land. That was the entire fact in front of me. Whatever else was true about them could wait. "Can you walk?" I asked. The smaller one, Sail, made a small sound, not quite a word, and shook her head, and I saw why when I looked. Her ankle had swollen up against the strap of a thin formal shoe that was never built for rough ground, and she'd likely turned it scrambling down off the road in the dark. Myra could walk. Sail couldn't. Not on that ankle. Not in this weather. Not the distance to my house. So, I carried her. I want to say that plainly because there's nothing more to it than that. I picked up a frightened 7-year-old girl who didn't know me from a stone wall, and she went rigid in my arms for the first 30 seconds, and then somewhere in the dark on the way up the hill, with the sleet coming sideways, she stopped fighting it, and put her face against my shoulder and held on. Myra walked alongside, close enough to touch the back of my coat the whole way, her jaw set, watching me the way you watch someone you haven't decided about yet. It is half a kilometer from that shelter up to my house, uphill the whole way, over ground that turns to slick clay the moment rain sets in, and I will not pretend it was an easy carry. Sail wasn't heavy, not by the standard of bales and posts I was used to hauling, but a frightened child holds herself wrong against you, every muscle locked tight against a fall that isn't coming, and that fights you more than the weight ever does. Twice I felt her shivering ease toward something stiller and more worrying than shivering, And both times I talked to her, nothing important, just the sound of a voice, telling her about the house we were headed for, the fire I'd have going, the dog who'd be glad to see visitors even at this hour, because I'd learned long ago with lambs too cold to stand, that the worst thing you can let happen is silence settling over something that's still fighting to stay with you. Keep the voice going. Keep them reaching towards something. It mattered less what I said than that I kept saying it. Myra never once asked to be carried herself, though I could see by the time we reached my gate that her own legs had gone past steady. She simply kept pace, silent, watching. A small, fierce shape in the lamplight, refusing to be the one who needed help while her sister still did. I understood something about her in that half-kilometer of climbing that took me a great deal longer to understand about her mother, and that was this. In that family, looking after the other one came before looking after yourself, as plain and automatic as breathing, and nobody had to teach either of them that. They'd been born into it. The compact officer caught us halfway up, breathing hard, and went to reach for the radio at his collar, and I said, "Get them warm first. Talk after." And something in my voice must have carried because he didn't argue. He just got ahead of us and opened my gate. Inside, I built the fire up properly, good dry birch, the kind that catches fast and burns clean. And I got both girls out of their wet things behind a blanket I hung over a chair for privacy. And I gave them what I had, which was my own flannel shirts, far too big, the sleeves rolled 4 times over, and the quilt off my own bed. The one my wife Annie had pieced together the winter before she died, blue and gray squares, soft from 12 years of washing. I didn't have anything fancy to feed them. I had bread and butter and a tin of soup I warmed on the stove, and I set it down without ceremony, the way you'd feed anyone who was cold and had had a hard day. And Myra watched me do all of it with that same flint-eyed wariness, like she was waiting to find the cost of it. "There's no charge," I told her, because I understood the look. "I'm not after anything. Eat." She ate, slowly at first, then like a child who'd been hungrier than she'd let on. Sale ate less, her color still bad, her ankle propped on a folded towel with a cold compress I'd made from a bag of frozen peas, because that was what I had, and she didn't complain about that either. There's a particular silence that settles over a room once the immediate danger has passed, and the slower work of recovery begins. And I sat with the two of them in that silence for a long while, mending the bandage on Sale's ankle properly, with the kit I kept for the sheep, clean gauze, a firm wrap, not too tight, while Myra watched my hands the entire time, tracking every motion the way a person does when they've learned that the careful study of someone's hands tells you more about their character than their words ever will. "You've done that before," she said eventually. "Angst." Her voice had thawed along with the rest of her, gone from chattering to something steadier, though still wary. "More times than I could count," I said. "Sheep get themselves into trouble out here regular as clockwork. A bad step, a wire fence, a fox that got too close. You learn to wrap a leg, or you lose the animal. We are not sheep," she said, and there was something in it that wasn't quite a fence, more like a child testing whether I understood the difference, whether I treat her as a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be minded. "No," I agreed. "You're worth a great deal more trouble than a sheep, and you're getting it." That seemed to satisfy something in her, because she went back to her soup and didn't ask anything else for a while. The compact officer wanted to move them right then, get them back to the rally point, but the storm had closed in hard by then, real weather, the kind that grounds vehicles and strands convoys, and even he could see it wasn't a night for moving 2 exhausted children back down a mountain road in the dark. He got on the radio and told whoever was listening where the girls were, that they were safe, that the weather had them pinned until morning, and I heard, even through the static, something on the other end of that call that sounded like a woman's voice breaking. He looked at me after. "Her Majesty wants to come herself tonight. I told her the roads are out. Then she waits till morning like everyone else has to," I said, not unkindly. "Tell her they're warm, they're fed, and they're not going anywhere they shouldn't." He relayed that, more or less word for word, and went quiet listening to whatever came back. And then he looked at me with an expression I didn't entirely understand yet. "She says, 'Thank you,'" he said. "She says she'll remember it." I didn't think much of that at the time. People say things like that in the heat of a frightening night, and don't always mean to be held to them. I went back to the girls. The hard part of the night wasn't the storm. It was staying awake. Sale's color worried me, not dangerous. The medic kit I had confirmed that much, but slow to come back. The kind of cold that settles into a small body and takes its time leaving. I dealt with enough half-frozen lambs in my years on that hill to know the shape of the danger. Not the cold itself so much as what happens after. If a body that's been pushed that hard slides into too deep a sleep too fast and doesn't fight its way back up out of it the way it should. So, I didn't let either of them sleep deep right away. I kept the fire built up, kept talking low, kept giving them small sips of warm broth every 20 minutes whether they wanted it or not, kept Sail's foot elevated and the compress fresh, kept an eye on the color of their lips and the steadiness of their breathing, the way you'd watch a ewe through a hard lambing. Myra fought sleep the longest, sitting bolt upright against the hearthstones with her sister's head in her lap, watching me with those flint eyes every time I moved, until somewhere past midnight, she finally asked the only question either of them had asked all night. "Why are you doing this?" I thought about how to answer that honestly because she deserved honesty, frightened as she was, more than she deserved comfort, because you were cold, and it was in my power to fix that, I said. I don't need a better reason than that. Never have. She studied me for a long moment, the firelight moving over a face that I'd come to understand, only much later, belonged to a girl who had been taught from infancy to read the angles in every kindness offered her, because so few of them came without a price attached. I watched her look for the price in mine and not find one, and something in her shoulders came down half an inch, the way a fence post settles once it's finally driven true. "Sail doesn't like being cold," she said, like that explained something, and maybe it did. "Then we'll keep her warm," I said. "That's not hard. That's the easiest thing in the world once you've decided to do it." She was quiet a while after that, watching the fire, her hand moving slow and absent through her sister's hair, the way I imagined someone had once done for her. Then, in a smaller voice than she'd used yet, she asked me something else. "Do you have children?" It was the kind of question that catches a man somewhere he doesn't expect to be caught, even 11 years on. "No," I said. "My wife and I wanted them. It didn't happen for us, and then she passed before we'd run out of trying to make peace with that." I hadn't said that out loud to another soul in years, and I'm still not entirely sure why I said it to a frightened 7-year-old by firelight, except that something about the honesty she'd asked of me seemed to deserve an honest answer in return, and there wasn't anyone there to perform for. Myra looked at me for a long moment, and then, very simply, she said, "I'm sorry." The way children sometimes do, with a directness adults have long since trained out of themselves, and went back to watching the fire, and I found I didn't mind the quiet that followed at all. I kept the broth coming through the small hours regardless of whether either of them wanted it, because that was the discipline I'd learned with lambs too cold for comfort. You don't let the body stop working at warming itself, even once the worst of the danger seems past, because the worst of it isn't always past just because the shivering stopped. I checked Sail's color every time I leaned in to refill the cups, watched the rise and fall of her breathing against her sister's shoulder, kept the fire steady rather than roaring, because a fire built up too hot too fast does more harm than good to a body that cold. There's a rhythm to it, a patience the work demands of you, and I'd had 11 years on that hill to learn it the hard way, lamb by lamb, bad night by bad night, until it had become something closer to instinct than thought. Somewhere around 2 o'clock in the morning, I finally let them both sleep proper because by then their color was good, and their breathing was even, and the fight had gone out of the storm enough that I trusted the night to hold. I banked the fire to burn slow and steady through till dawn, and I sat in the chair across from the hearth with my coat over my knees, not sleeping, just watching the two of them breathe. Myra's arm thrown protective over her sister even in sleep. Sail's small hand fisted in the quilt Annie made, and I thought, not for the first time in that house, that some nights the only job worth doing is staying awake so somebody else doesn't have to. The wind kept on outside, and somewhere down the valley I heard twice the distant sound of vehicles that didn't come closer. Search teams working the wrong ground, and I thought about getting up to signal them and decided against it. Moving from that chair, breaking that fragile, hard-won quiet, felt like a worse risk than letting the search run its course a while longer, while the two of them got the rest they needed. I told the officer where we were. That would have to be enough. My job for those few hours was smaller and plainer than search and rescue. Keep the fire fed, keep the room warm, keep still and let two exhausted children sleep without fear of the next thing that might be asked of them. I don't remember deciding to doze. I remember the gray coming up in the window, and the sound of vehicles on the road, more careful this time, picking their way over ground still slick from the storm, and I remember getting up stiff and quiet, so as not to wake either girl, and going to stand in my own doorway in the early light to see who'd come. The convoy that pulled up to my gate that morning wasn't the armored kind from the day before. It was a single transport, plain, fast, and a woman got out of it before it had fully stopped, moving the way people move when they've spent a night not sleeping and have run clean through fear and out the other side into something with no name yet. I knew who she was before anyone told me. There was a particular bearing some people carry, even half undone with worry, even in a plain traveling coat with her hair come loose from whatever arrangement it had started the night in, a stillness underneath the motion. A person used to being looked at and used to looking back evenly. Queen Obviath Solinvel had pale violet-gray skin gone almost ashen with the night she'd had, dark hair threaded with fine silver lineage marks now half fallen from their braid, and eyes the same struck flint gray gold as her daughter's, red-rimmed, wide, fixed on my doorway like she was afraid of what she might not find there. I stepped back and let her see past me. The girls were still asleep by the hearth, tangled together under Annie's quilt. The fire burned down to a steady orange glow, Myra's arm still thrown over her sister, both of them breathing slow and even and warm. I've seen a great many things in my life, and very few of them stopped me the way the sound the Queen made in that doorway stopped me. It wasn't a cry exactly. It was smaller than that, and worse than that. A sound torn loose from somewhere a sovereign isn't meant to let anyone hear. And she crossed my small room in 3 steps, and went down on her knees on the hearthstone, careless of the coat, careless of anything, and gathered both her daughters up against her at once. They woke into it the way children do, confused, then certain, then crying the particular relieved crying of someone who'd been holding it in all night because there hadn't been room for it. Sale's bad ankle made her wince, and the Queen adjusted without thinking, the way a mother's hands know to adjust before her mind has caught up to why, and held them both anyway, her face pressed into the top of Myra's head, her shoulders shaking in a way I understood she would not have permitted in front of any court in the galaxy, and was permitting now because there was no court here, only a stone floor and a banked fire and 2 who were warm. I stood back by the door and let it happen. It wasn't mine to be part of. It took a long while before she lifted her head. When she did, her eyes found me across the room, and I want to be honest that I didn't know what I was looking at. In that moment, grief still working its way out of her, relief not yet fully landed. And underneath both of those, something I'd only ever seen once before in my life. On the morning after Annie's surgery went better than the doctors had dared hope, the particular look of a person realizing the worst thing that could have happened did not happen, and trying to understand what to do with that much feeling all at once. "You found them," she said. Her voice was rough, used up from the night, and careful, like she was choosing every word with effort. "Myra found the shelter, and got a fire going before I ever got there," I said, because that was true, and she deserved to hear it. I just carried Sale the rest of the way, and kept the fire fed. "They told me." She looked down at her daughters, both of them quiet now, leaning into her, watching me with their mother's same steady regard. "They told me you did not ask who they were before you picked her up, that you fed them before you asked anything at all, that you sat awake the whole night so they would not." She stopped, started again lower, so they would not slip too deep. "Seemed the right order to do things in," I said. "Warm first, questions after. I've kept lambs alive that way more times than I can count, and a child's not so different far as that goes." Something crossed her face at that. Not offense, I want to be clear, though I worried for a half-second it might land that way, comparing a princess to a lamb. It was closer to wonder, like the plainness of it had landed somewhere a grander gesture never could have reached. She stood, settling Myra against one hip, and keeping a careful hand on Sale, who couldn't put weight on the bad ankle, and she looked around my small house, the worn furniture, the quilt that wasn't fine but was warm, the fire I'd kept burning all night for 2 children I'd never met. And then she looked at me for what felt like a long time. "I am going to ask you a question," she said, "and I would like the truth, not the answer you think I want. That's the only kind I give. Did you know who they were when you found them in that shelter?" "No," I said. "Found out from your officer on the way up the hill that they were Velsarai. Found out who you were when you stepped out of that transport just now. Far as I was concerned in the shelter, They were two cold, frightened children on my land, and that was the whole of what I needed to know. She nodded slowly, like she'd expected that answer, and needed to hear it spoken anyway. And then she said something in a language I didn't know, soft, formal sounding, 3 or 4 words, and Myra, still held against her mother's hip, repeated it back, quiet and careful, her eyes on me the whole time. Velsura then, the queen said after seeing my confusion. It does not translate cleanly. The closest I can offer in your tongue is my house has seen you. My house names you. My house will not set you aside. She held my gaze steady now, the worst of the shaking gone out of her. It is not spoken lightly. It is not spoken often. I have spoken it perhaps a dozen times in 30 years on the throne, always to people who have given my house something it could not have bought. I didn't do it to be thanked, I said, because I wanted that understood plainly before this went any further than it needed to. I know. And she said, that is precisely why I am saying it. There wasn't much more to that morning in the way of grand events. The compact officer came in to confirm the girls were fit to travel once Sale's ankle had been looked at properly, and the medics fussed over both of them while I made tea nobody quite finished. And the queen sat at my kitchen table scarred and plain, the one Annie and I bought second-hand 30 years before with a daughter in her lap, and another leaning against her shoulder. And for a while none of them said much of anything. They didn't need to. The not saying had its own weight. I busied myself at the stove because I didn't know what else to do with my hands, and because some part of me understood that a queen sitting in a stranger's kitchen undone with relief didn't need an audience for it so much as she needed the ordinary sounds of a house going on around her. A kettle, a fire being tended, the small domestic noise of a life continuing, to remind her that the worst had passed, and the world had kept turning regardless. I'd learned that much myself in the year after Annie, that sometimes the kindest thing anyone did for me was simply carry on making toast in the next room, and let me sit with my grief at my own pace, unwatched. At one point, the medic, a young woman with a kit full of equipment I didn't recognize, asked to examine me as well for exposure since I'd been out in the same storm carrying a child half a kilometer uphill, and I waved her off, told her I'd farmed that hill through 40 winters worth of weather, worse than this one, and I'd manage. The queen, watching this exchange, said something quiet to the medic in her own tongue, and the young woman came over anyway and took my pulse and my temperature with a brisk, gentle efficiency that broke no further argument, and pronounced me, eventually, stubborn but sound, which seemed to satisfy everyone but me. Before she left, the queen asked if she could see the lower pasture shelter, the one her daughters had reached on their own in the dark, and I walked her down there myself while the girls rested by the fire under the medic's watch. She stood a long while in that half-ruined stone shelter my grandfather built before either of us was born, looking at the cold ash of the small fire Myra had managed to start with shaking hands and wet wood, and nothing but her own determination. And she ran her fingers once over the dry stone wall like she was trying to understand it. She has never built a fire in her life, the queen said quietly. She has never needed to. And she built one well enough to keep her sister alive until you came. She did the hard part, I said. I just finished it. The queen looked at me then with an expression I didn't have a name for yet, and wouldn't. Not fully, until I understood her better in the months that followed. There are people in my court, she said, who have spent their whole lives positioning themselves to be useful to me, in hopes of exactly this kind of recognition. You not know who I was. You did not know what this might be worth to you. You simply did the plain thing the whole night through, and you would have done it for any 2 children who wandered onto your land, royal or otherwise. That is rarer than you understand, and it is worth more to me than anything any of those people have ever offered. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say much of anything, and she seemed to understand that too. She left that morning with both daughters settled in warm in the transport, Sales's ankle wrapped properly, Myra watching me out the back window until the vehicle turned onto the corridor road and was gone. I thought, honestly, that might be the whole of it, a strange night. A story I'd tell at the feed store for a year or 2, and then quiet again. It wasn't the whole of it. 3 weeks later, a formal letter came by courier, sealed in wax the deep blue-violet of the Velsurai house colors, inviting me by name, Corin Hale, no title attached because I had none and they didn't pretend otherwise, to the court's receiving hall, for what the letter called, in careful compact standard translation, a matter of public record-keeping. I'll admit I nearly didn't go. It isn't in my nature to stand in front of rooms full of people, and the thought of it sat poorly with me for most of those 3 weeks. A low hum of dread under everything else I did, the lambing, the fence, the ordinary turning of the season. But the morning of, I found myself pressing my one good jacket anyway, the same one I'd worn to Annie's funeral, and to almost nothing since, and I told myself it was a small thing, an hour or two out of a life that had plenty of hours to spare, and that the girls deserved whatever this was meant to be, even if I didn't fully understand it yet. I went in that jacket feeling out of place the whole way there, and stood at the base of a hall built of pale stone and tall glass that let the daylight pour in clean and bright. No shadows for ceremony to hide in, and watched Queen Obviath Solinvale stand before her assembled court, advisors, house representatives, the officer from that night among them, with both her daughters at her side, Sales's ankle long since healed, Myra's eyes finding mine across the room the moment I walked in. The hall itself surprised me. I'd half expected something heavier, all dark stone and old banners, the sort of place built to remind a visitor of his own smallness. Instead, the room was full of light, plain pale wood underfoot, the formal seating arranged in a wide arc rather than rows, so that no one in it was made to feel they were looking up at anyone else. I understood later that this was deliberate, a choice the Queen herself had made some years before, on the theory that a court that hides its business in shadow tends to grow comfortable with the kind of business that prefers shadow. I thought of my own house, plain and lit by firelight, and felt oddly less out of place than I'd expected to. She told the room what had happened, plainly, without embellishment, the way I'd have told it myself: the crash, the head count missed, the storm closing in, 2 children alone on a strange hill in failing light. And then she told them what came after. And when she got to the part about the fire I'd built and kept burning all night, and the broth given every 20 minutes, and the not asking who they were before I acted, her voice didn't break the way it had in my doorway, but something in it carried the same weight. I have been given gifts by sovereigns and warlords both in 30 years on this throne, she said, offered in hopes of binding my favor to their cause. I have learned to recognize the shape of a kindness with a price attached, because I have been offered so very many of them. This man offered no such thing. He saw 2 cold children and made them warm. That is the entire transaction, beginning and end, and it is the rarest gift I have ever been given. She turned then and addressed the room more directly than she had been, her hand resting briefly on Myra's shoulder. I want to be precise about what occurred, because precision matters more to me than any flattering version of it. My daughters were lost through an error in my own escort's protocol, and orders on my own watch, during an alert I myself had ordered. That failure belongs to this court and to me. What undid that failure in the end was not a larger guard or a faster vehicle or any of the things I have spent 30 years building to keep my house safe. It was one man with no standing in any court anywhere who happened to be awake on a cold hill and chose to stay that way through the whole of a bad night for 2 children who were nothing to him. I would like this assembly to sit with that a moment, because I have. She said the words again then, the ones she'd spoken in my doorway, formal this time, before the full assembly, and the chamber went quiet, in a way that told me even people who didn't know the old tongue understood the weight being placed in it. Corin Hale, my house has seen you. My house names you. My house will not set you aside. I didn't have a speech ready. I hadn't expected to need one. So, I said the only thing that felt true, standing there in my one good jacket in a hall built for grander people than me. I do it again tomorrow, I said, for your girls or for any 2 children cold on my hill. That's not something a person should need thanking for, but I'll take the thanks, since you've gone to the trouble of meaning it. Myra smiled at that. I learned later that she rarely did, not easily, not for strangers. And the Queen's eyes were wet, but her composure held, the way I'd come to understand it usually did. A woman who had spent 30 years learning to carry weight in front of a room, and let it down only where it was safe to. There was a part of the proceedings after that I understood only in pieces. Formal language about a standing acknowledgement entered into the sovereign record, a designation that meant, as near as the officer explained it to me afterward over tea, I didn't much want but drank anyway out of politeness, that I would always be received at that court without petition, that my name carried a weight there I had done nothing to earn beyond the one night, and that the weight would not lapse or be revoked except by my own choosing. I didn't fully grasp what that meant at the time, and I'm not sure I fully grasp it now, except that it has proven true in the small ways that matter. A letter answered the same week it sent. A door that opens without my having to explain myself at it. Afterward, in the quieter antechamber where the formality fell away, Sale came and stood in front of me with a particular seriousness only a 7-year-old can manage, and held out a small, smooth stone, gray shot through with one thin vein of gold. "From the shelter," she said. "I picked it up while you were carrying me." I don't remember picking it up. I found it in my pocket after. She put it in my hand and closed my fingers over it with both of her small ones. "Mother says you keep the things that matter, even when you don't remember choosing to." I still have that stone. It sits on the windowsill above my kitchen sink, the one where Annie used to keep her good teacups, and most mornings I see it before I see anything else. While the kettle's coming to boil and the lights coming up gray gold over the ridge. The Queen found me alone for a moment before I left that day, while the girls were occupied elsewhere with some piece of court business too dull to hold their attention long, and she said something to me then that I've turned over in my mind many times since. "I want you to understand something about that night," she said, because I do not think I said it plainly enough at the time. In my doorway, half out of my mind with relief, I have spent 30 years building walls and guards and protocols around those two girls, because the universe is not always a kind place to a sovereign's children, and I believed, until that night, that the strength of those walls was the whole measure of how well I was protecting them. What I learned on that hill is that all the walls in the world will not always be enough, and that what saved my daughters in the end was not a wall at all. It was a stranger's decision, made in the space of a few seconds in the cold and the dark, to be the kind of person who does not walk past a fire that needs tending. I cannot build more of that. I cannot buy it or command it into existing. I can only recognize it when I find it, and try to be worthy of having found it. I didn't know what to say to that, so I told her the truth, which was that I hadn't thought of it as a decision at all. Not really. Not in any way that felt like choosing. It had simply been the next right thing in front of me, the same as 100 other nights tending something small and cold and frightened on that hill, and I'd done it the same way I'd have done any of those without weighing it first. "Yes," she said, "that is precisely what makes it worth what it is worth. The Queen and I correspond now, twice a season or so. Nothing formal, how the lambing went, how the girls are growing, a question about the shelter wall I finally got around to repairing properly that spring. She visits the hill once a year, always in early autumn, always without the convoy of armored transports, just the one plain vehicle and her daughters, who run straight for the lower pasture every time, to see if the firing is still there, which it is, because I never had the heart to clear it away. Myra has taken these last 2 visits to asking me to teach her things, how to lay a fire properly, how to wrap a sprain once with great seriousness, how to mend a fence post so it would hold through winter. I don't know what she'll grow into, a girl born to a throne and raised on a hill's worth of plain lessons in between, but I find I don't worry about her the way I worried that first night about whether either of them would make it to morning. Sale, for her part, mostly wants to know if the lambs have names yet, and is disappointed every year when I tell her I don't name livestock, and every year brings me a list of names anyway, written out in careful, looping letters, in case I change my mind. People ask me sometimes, down at the feed store, what it's like knowing a queen, having princesses come stay on your hill once a year like it's the most natural thing in the world. I tell them what I told her that first morning, standing in my own doorway with 2 cold children breathing easy by the fire behind me, and it's still the truest thing I to say about any of it. I didn't do anything special. I just didn't look away.